For centuries, the history of the Persian Plateau has mainly been told through the rise and fall of powerful empires. We read about Cyrus the Great, Darius, and enormous armies fighting the great powers of Greece and Mesopotamia. These historical accounts often present the region as a place of sudden and dramatic change. It can appear as though every new empire created a completely new beginning and replaced the people who had lived there before. But written history, carved onto palace walls or pressed into clay tablets, usually records the actions of kings, soldiers, and ruling elites. It rarely records the quiet and continuous biological history of ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and herders. These were the people who cultivated the valleys of the Zagros Mountains and lived in the dry lowlands of Susa. Recently, scientists moved beyond written historical records. They extracted ancient DNA from human remains covering nearly 6,000 years. This allowed researchers to build a biological timeline directly comparing the prehistoric people of West Asia with the modern population of Iran. Their discoveries did more than fill a missing part of history. They challenged some of our basic assumptions about how human identities, languages, and civilizations develop over time. Chapter 1. The Basal Foundations of the Plateau. To understand the genetic history of the Persian Plateau, we must travel far back beyond the classical Persian empires. We must return to the late Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene period. Long before empires existed, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived in the rugged valleys of western Iran. When geneticists studied the genomes of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers from the Zagros Mountains in northern Iran, they discovered a highly distinctive ancestry. This population carried a remarkably high amount of what scientists call Basal Eurasian ancestry. The Basal Eurasian lineage represents an early branch of the modern human family tree. These people separated from other human populations after modern humans entered West Asia, but before the major migrations into Europe and East Asia. Remarkably, this Basal Eurasian lineage shows no detectable genetic mixture with Neanderthals. This makes it different from almost every other known ancient non-African population from that period. As the Ice Age ended, these hunter-gatherers became the direct ancestors of the early Neolithic farmers of the Eastern Fertile Crescent. Some of these farmers were buried at the famous archaeological site of Ganj Dar in the central Zagros Mountains. For many years, researchers believed that these early Zagros farmers were genetically the same as the hunter-gatherers living in the nearby Caucasus region. However, detailed genetic studies revealed a different picture. The Neolithic farmers of Iran had their own highly localized and distinctive genetic profile. They were closely related to the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, but they remained genetically separate from them. These ancient Iranian farmers created a stable local genetic foundation. This foundation later became the biological base of many future populations living across the Persian Plateau.
This deep genetic isolation is very important. In population genetics, ancient West Asia is often treated as one large and uniform region, but the genetic evidence from sites such as Ganj Dar shows us a different picture. The Eastern Fertile Crescent developed as an independent population center. These early highland communities were not simply part of farming migrations from the Levant or Anatolia. They belonged to a distinct local genetic lineage. This lineage developed within the Zagros Mountains and adapted to the region's unique mountain environment over thousands of years. This happened long before the first cities were built. It means that the biological history of the Persian Plateau has a strong local foundation. This foundation is even older than the agricultural revolution itself.
Chapter 2. Haltamti, the Lost World of Susa. As the early Neolithic farming communities grew and expanded, they helped create the foundation of one of the most enduring civilizations of the ancient Near East. This civilization was Elam. Elam was centered in the flat plains of modern Sistan and in the nearby valleys of the Zagros Mountains around Anshan. The Elamites called their homeland Haltamti. They did not speak an Indo-European language. They also did not speak a Semitic language. Their language, known as Elamite, is classified as a language isolate. This means that it has no confirmed relationship with Akkadian, Sumerian, or the later Old Persian language. Elamite civilization was one of the leading political and cultural powers of the ancient Near East. For almost 3,000 years, Elamite kings ruled from important cities such as Susa and Anshan. They maintained diplomatic, commercial, and military relations with Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. However, their cities were eventually conquered. Their language was also slowly replaced. Because of this, popular histories often describe Elam as only a civilization that existed before the Persian Empire. It is sometimes presented as a cultural stepping stone that disappeared when Cyrus the Great captured Susa. But did the Elamite people actually disappear? To answer this question, researchers needed to examine the biological evidence. In 2017, a team of Iranian researchers achieved an important scientific breakthrough. They extracted and studied mitochondrial DNA from 5 ancient human skeletons buried at the Middle Elamite site of Haltamti in Sistan. This study provided the first direct genetic evidence from the bodies of actual Elamite people. It established an early genetic reference point for the population of ancient Susa. It also prepared the way for a much larger international study. That later research examined how these ancient genetic lineages survived through the rise of the Persian empires and continued into the modern period.
This regional genetic pattern is very important because it challenges the old and simple idea of one uniform ancient Iranian population. Genetic evidence from the Bronze Age shows a wide east-to-west genetic gradient across the Persian Plateau. The population was not genetically the same in every region. In the west, places such as Haji Firas and Hazanlu carried higher levels of ancestry connected with Anatolian farmers. In central and northern Iran, Tipasar preserved a more stable genetic profile. This ancestry was mainly connected with the early Zagros farmers. In the southeast, Shar-i-Sokhta acted as a genetic gateway between the Persian Plateau and the Indus Valley. However, these regional populations were not completely isolated. They remained in regular contact and exchanged goods, ideas, traditions, and genes across the plateau. This created an ancient biological highway thousands of years before the Silk Road appeared.
Chapter 3: The Genomic Bridge of Dolphan. A major genetic study published in May 2025 expanded this research to an unprecedented level. An international team studied ancient DNA from 50 individuals found at 9 archaeological sites across Iran. These individuals lived between the early Copper Age and the medieval period. The oldest individual in this new genetic dataset came from Haltamti. The site is located on the eastern foothills of the central Zagros Mountains. Archaeologists recovered the remains of a young man who was identified by researchers as sample IRN-24. His skull provided an extraordinary anthropological discovery. The shape of his skull had been deliberately changed during infancy. This practice is known as artificial cranial deformation. It was common in parts of the central and southern Zagros during the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods. Similar examples have been discovered at earlier sites such as Ali Kosh and Toli Chega Sofla. This modified skull provides evidence of cultural continuity in the region. It shows that certain social practices and traditions survived for long periods of time. However, the nuclear DNA of this individual produced an even more important scientific discovery. Genetic modeling showed that the Geolaftian man was mainly descended from the local early Neolithic farmers of the Zagros Mountains. His closest ancient relatives included people from Ganj-Der, Wezma, and Tepe Abdul Hossein. However, his genetic profile also showed some ancestry from populations living farther west. Researchers estimated that around 17% of his ancestry came from Anatolian Neolithic farmers. This represents one of the earliest known examples of Western genetic influence entering the Zagros population. The discovery shows that the transition from the Neolithic period to the Chalcolithic period was not completely isolated or unchanged. Local highland farmers remained the main biological foundation of the region, but they were already participating in networks of trade, movement, and genetic exchange. These networks connected the Zagros Mountains with communities in Anatolia and other parts of the Fertile Crescent. Chapter 4: The Bronze Highway and the Sistan Outlier. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the Persian Plateau had become a busy network of trade and cultural interaction. As early cities developed, certain settlements became specialized centers for producing and distributing valuable goods. One of the most important centers was Shar-i-Sokhta, also known as the Burnt City. It was located in the dry Sistan basin of southeastern Iran. Shar-i-Sokhta developed into a major center of the ancient world. The site covered more than 25 hectares. Its enormous cemetery contained over 40,000 graves. These graves included pottery, bronze objects, and beautifully worked lapis lazuli. The archaeological evidence shows that Shar-i-Sokhta was a wealthy and highly organized society. Polished stamp seals and decorated cosmetic containers have mainly been discovered in female graves. This may suggest that women held important administrative, economic, or social positions within the community. When geneticists studied skeletons from Shar-i-Sokhta, they discovered a striking genetic pattern. The population was not genetically grouped with the farmers of the western Zagros Mountains. Instead, the people of Shar-i-Sokhta were positioned along what scientists call the Indus Periphery Cline. This was a genetic gradient connecting populations from West Asia and South Asia. The ancient people of southeastern Iran carried an important genetic contribution related to Andamanese hunter-gatherers. This ancestry represents a deep South Asian component also associated with the population of the Indus Valley civilization. At the same time, the settlement of Tepe Hisar in northern Iran maintained a very different genetic profile. The people living near the Zagros Mountains preserved a stable northern plateau ancestry. Shar-i-Sokhta acted as an eastern genetic center with strong South Asian connections. In contrast, Tepe Hisar and nearby Caspian communities maintained a more stable local genetic foundation. They also carried much less ancestry from Western Anatolian farming populations.
The elite dominance model challenges the old idea of a sudden and complete Aryan replacement on the Persian Plateau. For many years, some nationalist stories and early historical theories claimed that the arrival of Persian-speaking groups created a complete biological break from the earlier population. But genetic evidence shows that culture and biology can change at very different speeds. Languages and political systems can spread quickly, while the local population remains mostly the same. Modern Persian, Kurdish, and Laristani people are not simply genetic migrants from the Eurasian steppes. To a remarkable degree, they are direct biological descendants of the ancient Elamites, Kassites, and Zagros farmers. These earlier populations built some of the first cities of southwestern Iran. The Persian identity later became a powerful cultural and linguistic umbrella. It united a deeply rooted highland population that had lived on the plateau for thousands of years.
Chapter 5. The Empires of Iron and Bronze. As the Bronze Age changed into the Iron Age, the political structure of the Persian Plateau became more centralized. The powerful Neo-Elamite Empire emerged and rebuilt its authority around Susa. It also confronted the growing military power of the Assyrian Empire. Important archaeological discoveries at Jabaji in Khuzestan reveal the wealth and power of this period. Archaeologists discovered a royal tomb containing two extraordinary bronze coffins shaped like bathtubs. Inside the coffins were the remains of two Elamite princesses from the royal Shuddernahanti family. They were buried with large amounts of gold jewelry, metal utensils, and finely decorated personal objects. These discoveries show the rich artistic and political traditions that continued shortly before the rise of the Persian Empire. But an important question remains. How did these regional Iron Age populations move into the classical period of the great Persian empires? The genetic study published in May 2025 examined this transition closely. Researchers analyzed individuals from the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid periods at several sites in northern Iran. At Marsin Chal in Semnan, archaeologists discovered human remains from the Achaemenid to Seleucid period. The individuals were buried with bronze weapons and personal jewelry. These objects suggest the existence of a highly organized warrior society. Farther north, the Parthian cemetery of Liarsangbin in Jilin province contained more than 130 different types of burials. The graves contained local pottery and personal ornaments. They also included unusual objects from Roman Egypt. These foreign objects show that Jilin was connected with long-distance maritime and land-based trade routes. These routes later became part of the wider Silk Road network. The Liarsangbin cemetery also produced an extraordinary discovery. Researchers identified two genetically identical male twins. They were recorded as samples IRN23 and IRN25. Their twin relationship was confirmed through both skeletal examination and detailed genome-wide genetic testing. At the Sassanid period site of Vestamin in Mazandaran, archaeologists found carefully arranged horse burials beside human graves. These burials point to the existence of a highly developed cavalry culture. This military class helped the Sassanid Empire defend and control its northern frontiers. When scientists compared the genomes of these classical period individuals with earlier populations, they discovered something remarkable. Despite major wars, foreign invasions, and political changes over more than 1,000 years, the people of northern Iran showed strong and continuous genetic stability. The ordinary people buried in these cemeteries were direct biological descendants of the local Chalcolithic and Bronze Age communities. Their ancestry was also connected with nearby populations from South Central Asia, including communities associated with the Oxus civilization.
We must be scientifically careful when discussing this evidence. Connecting a modern genetic component with a specific prehistoric language family is a major interpretive step. Critics of the Elamo-Dravidian hypothesis have raised several important concerns. Researchers still do not have enough high-quality ancient DNA taken directly from mature Harappan or ancient Elamite skeletons. The Karaga community also experienced a long period of isolation and a very severe population bottleneck. According to the study, this bottleneck was around 5 times stronger than the one experienced by Ashkenazi Jewish populations. Because of this, genetic drift may have made the Karaga genetic profile appear more distinctive than it originally was. However, the discovery is still extremely important. Scientists can now trace an autosomal genetic connection between modern South Indian communities and a 10,000-year-old individual from the Zagros Mountains. This is an extraordinary achievement of modern paleogenomics. The evidence provides a possible biological framework that fits with David McAlpin's linguistic model. It also reminds us that the modern borders separating West Asia and South Asia did not exist during the deep history of humanity.
Chapter 6: Elite Dominance and the Silent State. This strong biological continuity creates an important historical puzzle. If the local genetic foundation remained stable from the Bronze Age until the Sassanid period, how did the Persian Plateau experience such a major cultural and linguistic transformation? Historical linguistics and archaeology suggest that early Iranic-speaking groups entered the plateau from the Eurasian steppes. These groups included the ancestors of the Medes and early Persians. They probably moved into the region during the middle and later parts of the 2nd millennium BCE. These mobile pastoralist groups carried steppe-related ancestry. Many of them were also associated with the paternal genetic lineage known as R1a-Z93. However, ancient genomes from the Persian, Parthian, and Sassanid periods contain only a small amount of this Bronze Age steppe ancestry. In some historical samples from northern Iran, it is almost completely absent. How is this possible? The answer may be found in a demographic process called elite dominance. A small but highly mobile and militarily organized group can enter a region inhabited by a much larger population of settled farmers. The newcomers may successfully introduce their language, political system, and social traditions without replacing the local population. The incoming steppe pastoralists mixed with the much larger population already living on the Persian Plateau. They married local women and established themselves as political and military elites. Over many generations, their distinctive genetic ancestry became increasingly diluted within the much larger local population. The language and culture of the plateau gradually became Iranic. However, the biological ancestry of the people remained mainly connected to the Neolithic and Chalcolithic farmers of ancient Southwest Asia. Chapter 7: The Elamo-Dravidian Corridor. The genetic continuity of the Persian Plateau is an important discovery for the history of West Asia. However, recent paleogenomic research has also opened a second and more controversial possibility. This connection extends thousands of kilometers eastward, across Baluchistan and into southern India. For more than 100 years, historical linguists have debated a possible relationship between the ancient Elamite language and the Dravidian languages of South Asia. Today, Dravidian languages are spoken by more than 250 million people, mainly in southern India. The Elamo-Dravidian hypothesis was explained in detail by linguist David McAlpin in 1981. The hypothesis suggests that early Dravidian speakers may have migrated into South Asia from an ancient homeland near the Zagros Mountains of southwestern Iran. These migrants may have carried agricultural knowledge and an early language. This language may later have divided into the Elamite and Dravidian branches. In 2025, a major population genetics study published in the European Journal of Human Genetics presented new biological evidence connected with this possible relationship. The researchers studied the Karaga community of southwestern India. The Karaga are a highly marginalized indigenous community living in the coastal region of Karnataka. They speak an archaic and unwritten Dravidian language. This language has preserved several ancient grammatical features of the wider Dravidian language family. When scientists studied the genomes of the Karaga, they found an unusual genetic pattern. Earlier studies had already shown that the community carries a high frequency of the West Eurasian maternal lineage known as mitochondrial haplogroup U1. At the same time, many Karaga men carry the indigenous South Asian paternal lineage H1a. Using genome-wide genetic analysis, researchers identified a distinctive ancestral component in the Karaga population. They estimated that this genetic component developed around 4,400 years ago. The researchers tentatively described it as Proto-Dravidian ancestry. Further genetic dating suggested that this ancestry emerged around the beginning of the Indus Valley Civilization. Most importantly, genetic modeling connected this ancestry with a much older population. The relationship appears to extend back around 10,000 years to a Neolithic individual from Ganj Dar in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. Chapter 8. Reconstructing the Holocene Corridor. This genetic connection suggests a possible unified model for the ancient history of West Asia and South Asia. During the early Holocene, a long demographic corridor may have connected the Zagros Mountains with the Indus Valley. One branch of this ancestral population may have moved westward. These people settled in the lowlands of Susa and contributed to the development of the urban and literate Elamite civilization centered at Susa. Another branch may have moved eastward along the coastal Makran route. These migrants may have carried agricultural practices and an early form of Dravidian speech toward the Indus Valley. There, they mixed with local South Asian hunter-gatherer populations. Over time, these mixed communities contributed to the development of major Indus cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. After the decline of the Indus Valley civilization, populations carrying this Proto-Dravidian-related ancestry may have moved into other parts of the Indian subcontinent. They mixed with local communities and contributed to the formation of modern Dravidian-speaking populations in southern India. The Karaga community remained socially and culturally isolated for thousands of years. Around 1,000 years ago, the community also experienced a severe population bottleneck. Because of this long isolation, the Karaga gene pool may have preserved this ancient West Asian-related genetic signature in a particularly concentrated form. Conclusion. The comparison of modern Persian DNA with ancient Elamite and Zagros genomes reveals an important truth about human history. Beneath the wars, changing borders, foreign conquests, and shifts in official languages, there is a quiet and continuous river of biological ancestry. Empires rose and fell. Capital cities were destroyed and rebuilt. Languages changed from Elamite to Old Persian and eventually to modern Farsi. However, through all these transformations, most of the population remained in the same region. They preserved their deep genetic roots across thousands of years of historical change. Human DNA does not represent one clean and simple ancestral line. It is a complex and layered record of the past. It contains the silent genetic traces of ancient hunter-gatherers, early farmers, Elamite princesses, and generations of people who walked across the Persian Plateau long before us. Does knowing that human ancestry is more continuous and interconnected than modern political and linguistic borders change the way you understand national identity? Thank you for watching.